midnight screams.
The Appalachian Trail attracts tourists from all over the world. Hiking it is considered a rite of passage to some, but the stunning views are what brought my friend and coworker Jeremy and me to the Smokies. We trekked out Saturday through the mountain trail in North Carolina, just below Tennessee, eager to witness the wildlife and brilliant fall landscapes. The sun cast warm beams through the spruce firs. The sky was a magnificent pinkish golden hue that resonated within me and filled me with a long-lost appreciation for this world. "Lovely, isn't it?" Jeremy stated. He bit into a granola bar with a hearty crunch, and a few crumbs landed in his fluffy black beard. He looked like a mid-20s Santa, rosy cheeks and all. Sure beats the office. I don't know. I kind of miss corporate meetings and the soothing sounds of the broken printer. Jeremy's smile widened. Or Greg's scoffing at every email request he receives? Something very zen about that too. Very soul-soothing, he joked back. "All right, Office Max, let's hit the trail." The September chill was invigorating, although it was a bit colder than I'd dressed for. I pulled up the hood on my jacket and followed Jeremy's lead, a bit surprised at seeing my stocky friend hiking up the incline so effortlessly. This was the first time we'd done anything together aside from knocking back beers over pool games or the occasional meal out. He married young and usually reserved day trips like these for his wife. She was out west with her family this time, and I was happy to oblige his offer. Twigs cracked beneath my boots as I followed Jeremy. The trees were brilliant gradients of orange, yellow, and green. Basswoods, dogwoods, and magnolias popped in a vibrant, patchwork panorama. It was truly breathtaking, and I appreciated Jeremy inviting me along on the nature walk. But then, an hour in, Jeremy decided to stray from the plotted path. We'd rounded a few narrow dirt paths to reach an overhang where Jeremy wanted to take a photo. It was an exposed face of the mountain, offering a clear view of a valley below. It was obvious why he decided to take a detour for a photo op. It was gorgeous. I wheezed, a bit out of breath, as we finally climbed up the steep ridge. He slapped a gloved hand on my shoulder, and I smiled into the phone's camera lens as well. He'd framed a great pic of us, with the enormous valley behind us. But then the device slipped from his hand and onto the steep dirt hill. We watched it tumble down into the dense cluster of trees at the bottom. "Fuck!" Jeremy yelled. I really didn't look forward to climbing all the way down, then all the way back up again. "Is it cool if I stay here while you get it?" I asked, eager for a break. My calves were sore and tight, and I was out of breath. "Man, you're such an indoor kid," he smirked. I shrugged. I mean, he wasn't wrong. "Sure, I'll see you in a bit." I watched Jeremy descend the steep incline, winding down off the path and into the stark shadows of the woods. "Just keep calling it, so I can follow the ring." "No prob," I called back, and Jeremy, just a small form among the valley of pines, vanished. I only then realized how utterly isolated this area of the forest was. We hadn't come across another hiker in over 45 minutes, and I gathered our little detour from the main trail must have taken longer than I'd thought. Aside from the rustling of leaves and the occasional creaking of swaying branches, it was quiet. A loud snapping sound echoed up from the basin, a tree branch more than likely. I dialed Jeremy's number, and soon after, I heard a very faint ringtone. The phone must have tumbled farther than I realized. I shook my head, well aware his screen was likely shattered and he'd be using mine for photos the rest of the hike. I heard the ringing phone continue for a bit, then stop as it went to voicemail. "See it?" I yelled down the side of the steep incline. The cold air was starting to numb my cheeks. Winter was on its way. No response from Jeremy. I redialed, then listened to the faint ringing from the deep woods below. When it finally went to voicemail once again, I felt a bit anxious. "Jeremy?" I yelled down. A woodpecker's rapid knocking carried over the valley from some unseen tree, but no other sound at all. "Jeremy, you okay?" I shouted down. Only the rattling groans of the trees and occasional cracking of branches was heard from below. I decided to go check on him. Hiking down the decline was easy, but I was well aware the climb back up was waiting. I was careful not to slip as I left the trail and edged my way down into the thick wooded valley where Jeremy had vanished. The pines had looked so small from up on the path, but as I descended, I realized they were enormous. It was a dense wilderness in the basin. Light barely penetrated the intertwined pine needles and leaves. "Jeremy," I called out. I should have been within hearing distance, but he still didn't respond. I called his phone once again. It rang close by. I followed the sound, spotting it a few meters ahead on the forest floor. Sure enough, the screen was cracked, but it had miraculously survived. Then I noticed something white and pearl-like on the forest floor. I walked closer and squatted down to analyze it. My guts shifted, and my throat closed a bit as I realized what I was looking at. A human tooth. "Hey, Jeremy, are you okay?" I called out. I'd seen him reach the bottom, so I knew he hadn't fallen. Might not be his, I thought, and I peered into the endless pillars of tree trunks that sprawled out into the valley. Though hesitant, I decided to walk a bit in. "Jeremy!" I yelled into the woods. I could hear my own voice faintly echo off the surrounding mountains. I tried to rationalize that maybe Jeremy had just headed a bit inward to relieve himself, but I was getting a bit scared. I felt the fall leaves and pine needles soften my steps as I continued on. I then saw another small white shape on the ground. It was a bloody human molar, roots and all. The leaves surrounding it were flecked with droplets of fresh red blood. Any notion of bravery was quickly abandoned due to the fact those teeth landed there recently. I needed to get out of the woods and call the police. I turned back and headed towards the wood's edge in a brisk walk, wishing it was closer. I was a good 30 meters in, and I quickened my pace into a brisk jog. I felt a wave of relief when I saw his hand around a tree up ahead. "Jeremy!" I yelled out, but my jog slowed to a stop, and my insides went cold. The hand wasn't as far away as I'd thought it was. Its size had created an optical illusion of sorts. It wasn't Jeremy's. It had long, white fingers and bulbous knuckles, and looked distorted, as if a normal human hand had been elongated, somehow stretched out to become twice the length. Worry melted into horror as a large, strange head peeked out from the other side of the thick tree. It was horrible, a mess of pale, saggy flesh that clung loosely to an enormous, stretched skull. A bizarre, exaggerated grin that split the face in two was filled with little pointed nubs of teeth, glistening red. There was no visible nose amid the folds of bunched flesh under the eyes, which were the worst feature by far. The eyes were perfectly spherical, white orbs glossy and wet, that stared at me with eagerness. The way an animal stares at its food. I froze, unable to peel my gaze away from the hideous face that leered at me from behind the tree. It was far too high up as well, nearly 8 feet up from the leafy ground, though it was clearly hunched. I took a hesitant step backward, and as I did, it emerged. Long, soap-white arms and legs extended from the cover of the thick tree trunk, with knobby knees and pronounced ribs. It resembled a person suffering from starvation, or perhaps extreme anorexia, yet scaled up to the size of a giant. I stepped back a bit more, my boot squishing into something. I glimpsed down to see a mound of pulpy flesh beneath my boot. It was half of a human hand, a wedding band on the base of a finger missing the tip. It was Jeremy's hand. I then heard what might have been misconstrued as the wind bending those tall trees. That thing was making the sound. It took a long stride in my direction, the horrible gash of a grin dripping strings of saliva in anticipation. I ran. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I fled. Adrenaline pumped through me as I ran deeper into the dense woods, away from that horrific giant. Wisps of ragged branches scratched my face and snagged my jeans. I soon passed shreds of clothing, chips of bone, and clumps of hair. I ran past stripped finger bones and even a meatless femur. All that remained of Jeremy were the inedible parts. I was going to die in those woods. I slowed my pace when I saw movement up ahead in the distance. 2 naked figures, slender, absurdly tall and terribly deformed, stalked the woods with the same wide, bulging white eyes and hideous grins. They hadn't spotted me yet. My heart was pounding so hard I feared they'd hear it. I looked back, seeing that long-limbed thing striding forward. I was pinned. My only chance was to hide. I frantically scanned the area and found a wide-trunked tree that looked rotted and hollowed near the roots. It seemed like the best shot, so I raced over and squeezed myself into the hollowed base of the tree, ignoring the tearing of my jacket and the burn from scraping my skin in the process. I hushed my breathing and waited as still and as quietly as I could. A few minutes later, the sound of cracking of twigs and crushed leaves drew closer. I watched through a gap in the bark as panic flooded my mind. That strange vocalization sounded once again, followed by another voice from further out in the dense forest. They were communicating. A few other rattlings, throaty sounds were made before I heard the sound of footsteps continue on, getting quieter and quieter as they continued on into the woods. I breathed out in relief, but then the view to the woods was blocked by a long, horrific face. One of those things had leaned down to look into the open gap and was now staring directly at me, just a foot away. It was enormous, twice the height of my own head. Those milky white eyes stared at me, and I was sure these were my final moments. The dripping smile of that creature quivered, and it cocked its head slightly to the side. After a few seconds of reeling from the horror of its presence, I understood it wasn't seeing me at all. It was blind. Its breath was rotten and gamey. It wheezed through those small, sharp teeth and stared at me with those unseeing eyes for a few minutes, but it eventually stood, vanishing from my view. I then listened to the leaves rustle as it walked away, off to some other section of the vast forest. I stayed in that hollow of the trunk for maybe an hour before I finally braved peeking out. They were gone. I was cautious to make little noise as I backtracked as best I could, I feared I'd lost my way and was heading deeper still towards those enormous things, but the mountainside soon became visible through the leaves. I'd gotten back to the area I'd found Jeremy's detached, mangled hand, but it was gone. The cell phone was too, as well as the teeth. Nothing remained of my friend. I climbed out of the valley and began my return, all the while making calls to the park rangers and the local police. By the time I'd made it back to the car, it was surrounded by patrol cars as well as an ambulance. Officers, rangers, and paramedics were milling about, and they all were eager to question me. I explained the events that had transpired. The police were skeptical, as were the paramedics and rangers. But one weathered, older park ranger named Bob took me aside after the statements were made. Bob looked at me with remorse. He then looked out into the sea of trees and spoke. My grandfather told me a folk tale when I was a child, one that terrified me, one he swore was real. The story of the stretched people of Appalachia. It was an old tale of a family that fell into a cave and were trapped ages ago. Incest and evolution kept them going. The kids with the longest limbs were kept alive, the others used for food. Evolution in the cave took their sight, but selective breeding heightened their stature bit by bit each following generation. I wished it to be a scary story to keep kids in line. I never wanted to believe him when he said he saw one in his youth from the mouth of a hidden cave. I never wanted to believe they were real. Bob's eyes grew wide and his voice quivered with fear as he continued, or that they could eventually grow tall enough to get out. In deep Appalachia, Halloween night comes with rules. I've lived my entire life in a holler on the outskirts of Wyoming County, West Virginia, deep in the mountains of Appalachia. It's a place so remote most folks don't even know it exists on a map. Just a handful of families in dense, unforgiving woods. This place doesn't have neighborhoods, doesn't have sidewalks, and most definitely does not have trick-or-treaters on Halloween. Halloween isn't a holiday here. It's a test. My family, and the others who've lived here long enough to know, follow a set of rules on Halloween night. It's not tradition or superstition. It's survival. Those who didn't follow the rules didn't live long enough to tell anyone about it. Our rules aren't just about keeping doors locked or avoiding dark places. They're specific, with reasons rooted in events we don't talk about. My dad always said they came from my great-grandmother's time, when people came to these mountains from Scotland and still believed in the old ways. Whether it's spirits or something else that's out there, or things just too old to name, Halloween night here has always been a game of life and death, and each rule existed to give you just enough of an edge to make it through till morning. The first time I broke a rule, I learned why they exist, and I'll never forget it. Every October, around the second week, the rules went up on the fridge. We lived by them. My family took them seriously, and not just in a keep the kids safe kind of way. No, these rules were for everyone. Break one, and you'd put us all in danger. Here's how they go. If you hear 3 knocks at the door after sunset, do not answer. If you hear a single hard knock, open the door. But do not look at who stands there. Hold out a basket of freshly baked bread, and wait until you hear the footsteps leaving to shut the door. If you hear someone call your name from the woods, do not answer. If you see a figure at the tree line wearing a wide-brimmed hat, do not look at him for longer than 1 second. If you hear chains dragging on the ground, Sprinkle salt on all windowsills and door thresholds within 1 minute. If a candle is burning in the window of the old, abandoned Anderson cabin up the hill, stay indoors, no matter what. These rules didn't exist for no reason. They were handed down because bad things had happened. People vanished, people died, and strange things occurred. That's just how it was. I remember one specific year, years back, when Halloween night fell on a full moon. The air felt different, charged. My dad had a sense for when things were going to be bad. You could just feel it in the holler, thick in the air, like something breathing down your neck. Dad told us to get all the preparations done early. Salt the windows now, he instructed, standing by the door, his face tight with worry. We're not waiting for the chains. I followed his orders without question, pouring salt along each windowsill and at the front and back door thresholds. My brother was baking bread, already anticipating rule number 2, the one we hated the most. It was the one that forced us to interact with whatever knocked, whatever stood on the other side of that door. We never knew who or what it was, but we knew if you didn't offer bread, or if you dared to look, it wouldn't be good. By late afternoon, the house was fortified. The bread was cooling on the counter, its smell filling the kitchen. The fire was lit, burning low, and a 12-gauge lay across Dad's lap like it always did on Halloween. Isaac, my younger brother, sat closest to the window, glancing out every now and then. We had about 3 hours before sunset. The rules were clear. Everything bad happened after dark. But the waiting was the worst part. The longer we sat there, the more anxious we became. "Did we use enough salt this year?" Isaac asked quietly. Dad didn't answer. He just stared into the fire, gripping the gun tighter. That was answer enough. The first knock came just after dark. A single knock, slow and deliberate. Isaac and I froze, staring at the door. Dad stood up, motioning for us to stay back and be quiet. I swallowed hard, heart pounding in my chest. It was time to follow Rule 2. Without a word, Dad picked up the basket of bread from the counter, freshly baked, still warm. He walked to the door, resting one hand on the knob. "Remember," he said, his voice low and steady, "don't look." He opened the door just wide enough to slip the basket through the crack, his eyes focused on the floor. The warm smell of the bread wafted out, and I could hear a faint shuffling on the porch. Whoever, or whatever it was out there. I saw a flicker of movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow stretching across the porch, but I didn't dare look. Dad held the basket out, his hand shaking slightly. For a few heartbeats, there was no sound, no movement, and then footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps retreating from the porch. He waited until they faded completely, then shut the door quietly, locking it tight. Isaac let out a breath. "Why don't we just leave the bread out early? Why do we have to wait for the knock?" Dad's face was pale, and his eyes were hard. "We have to wait for the knock, and if we don't answer the knock, it'll come in." We thought it was over. We had followed Rule 2 to the letter, and for a moment it seemed like things were quiet. But here, nothing stays quiet for long on Halloween. Isaac was the first to notice him. He was standing at the edge of the woods, just where the trees meet the clearing. He was tall and thin, a wide-brimmed hat casting his face in shadow. He didn't move, didn't make a sound, but he was there, watching. Isaac gasped, pointing. "It's him," he whispered, voice trembling. Dad didn't need to ask who. He knew. We all did. The man in the hat. "Don't look at him," Dad snapped. Not for more than a second. I glanced, just enough to confirm he was there. A tall, dark figure, almost blending into the shadows of the trees, but distinct enough to make my blood run cold. I looked away quickly, heart hammering in my chest. We got away from the doors and windows of the house and sat huddled in the living room, the fire our only light. Outside, the man in the hat stood at the tree line, unmoving as the night crept on. It wasn't until after midnight that we heard the chains. At first, it was faint, a metallic clinking that seemed distant, almost like it could have been the wind. But it grew louder, closer, until it was unmistakable. The sound of chains being dragged across the rocky ground outside. Isaac's face turned pale. He shot me a look, wide-eyed and terrified. "The salt," he whispered. Dad nodded grimly. "Go check." I got up slowly, trying to control the tremor in my legs. I circled the house, inspecting every window and door frame. The salt lines were intact. Nothing had disturbed them. The chains continued to scrape outside, dragging closer and closer. But we didn't dare open the door. We didn't dare look. We stayed inside, sitting together in the flickering light of the fire, listening to the sound of the chains until the first light of dawn broke through the windows. We had made it through the night. The man in the hat was gone. The chains had stopped. But as the morning light seeped through the shutters, I glanced toward the old Anderson cabin up the hill. And there it was. A single candle still burning in the window. The rules are clear. When the candle burns in the Anderson cabin, you stay inside. No exceptions, no excuses. Even with the sun beginning to shine and the birds beginning to chirp, the sight of that candle filled me with a primal fear. We have to wait until the candle goes out before we can go outside, before the night is truly over. And that's how it goes here. The rules aren't just there to be followed. They're there to keep you alive. And if you're smart, you don't ask questions. Sometimes it's better not to know. Halloween here had always been terrifying, but last year was different. It wasn't just the usual unease or the normal anxiety that came with the setting Sunday. It almost felt like the rules weren't enough anymore. My dad was getting older, his movements slower, his hands a little less steady. We all knew it, but no one said anything. We just followed the rules like always, hoping that would be enough. We spent the day in preparation, salting the windows, baking the bread, the usual. Isaac and I were jittery, pacing around, double-checking everything. With my dad getting older, we felt a greater pressure to take it upon ourselves to prepare. The sky darkened faster than usual, clouds rolling in from the west, blotting out the last rays of the Sunday. By the time dusk fell, the fire was burning low, and the house sat in darkness. Dad sat in his usual spot by the door, the shotgun across his lap. The basket of bread, fresh out of the oven, sat next to him. We all waited, our hearts pounding in the silence. I kept glancing at the windows, expecting to see the figure in the hat or hear the drag of chains. And then it came. A single knock, loud and deliberate. Dad stood up, just like every other year. "Stay put," he muttered, picking up the basket with his trembling hands. His face was pale, but his voice was steady. Isaac and I exchanged a nervous glance as Dad approached the door. As always, I stared at the floor, focusing on the sound of crackling fire and trying to block out the sense of dread that had settled in my gut. He opened the door a crack, just enough to push the basket through without seeing whatever waited on the other side. But this time, something went wrong. As Dad leaned forward, he knocked the basket against the door frame and lost his grip. The bread tumbled out, scattering across the porch. The sudden movement, the noise. Without thinking, I looked up. I looked at it, and I saw it. It wasn't a man. It wasn't anything I could name. It stood hunched over, far too tall to be human. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its skin pale and stretched tight over bones that jutted out at odd angles. Its face was sunken, like a skull with pale white skin pulled tight over it. And its eyes were wild and wide, too wide, like it didn't have eyelids. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, a black, gaping hole that emitted a horrible, deafening wail. It was a sound I had never heard before, like metal scraping against stone, but worse. It drilled into my skull, making my ears ring and my vision blur. Before I could react, before I could even scream, the thing lunged. Its bony hand shot out, grabbing my dad by the collar. In one terrifyingly quick motion, it yanked him off the porch, dragging him toward the woods. The sound of his body scraping against the ground, his muffled cries, and the creature's horrible wail all blurred together into a scene of pure terror. Isaac screamed first. I was frozen, my mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. But Isaac's scream jolted me back to reality. "Dad!" Isaac yelled, bolting for the door. I followed, my legs shaking, and my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst out of my chest. We ran out into the cold night air, toward the edge of the woods where we could still hear Dad's faint cries. But before we could take more than a few steps, I saw it. The candle. A single flickering light in the window of the old Anderson cabin. My blood ran cold. We had come outside when the candle was burning. I grabbed Isaac's arm, pulling him to a stop. "Wait," I whispered, voice shaking. The cabin. As if on cue, the door of the cabin suddenly flew open with a loud crash, as if something unseen was about to come storming out. Something angry, something that should not have been awakened. "We have to go!" I shouted, dragging Isaac back toward our house. We scrambled inside, slamming the door shut behind us. I locked it, my hands trembling so badly I could barely turn the key. The shotgun was still on the floor by Dad's chair, but it felt useless. What good would it do against something like that? But the night was far from over. We huddled in the living room, terrified, waiting for the next rule to break. Isaac was crying, his hands shaking as he tried to steady his breathing. I stared at the door, half expecting something to come crashing through at any moment. The chains came next. We heard them clattering on the ground, dragging closer and closer. I grabbed the bag of salt, getting ready to double-check the lines of salt we had placed down earlier. The chains dragged right up to the front door, the metallic clinking echoing in the silence. I could hear it just outside, scraping against the wooden steps of the porch. But I knew the salt would hold. It always did. Or so I thought. Isaac was the first to notice it. We had forgotten to resalt the front door threshold after going outside. The wind from the open door had disturbed our salt line. Just as I was about to rush toward the door to resalt it, I heard the chains and a creaking against the door. It sounded as though a heavy weight was slowly leaning against it. I knew we didn't have time. I began to back away, motioning to Isaac to go to the bedroom. Isaac screamed as the door burst open. We ran into the back bedroom, hearts pounding, breaths coming in ragged gasps. I quickly salted in front of the door to the bedroom and checked the windows. "It's in the house," I whispered. I could feel it, a presence, something cold and malevolent, creeping through the house toward us. I don't know how long we waited, or how long we listened to the chains pacing back and forth through our house. Eventually, we heard them go back outside. Slowly, we left the bedroom and quietly closed and locked the front door. I placed a fresh line of salt in front of the door and breathed a sigh of relief. We were safe for now. And then we heard it again. A knock. But not the single knock, and not the 3 knocks. This was something new, something that didn't fit the rules. It was a rapid, frantic pounding, as if whatever was out there wanted in. Now, my heart stopped. The rules didn't cover this. Isaac looked at me, eyes wide with terror. What do we do? I didn't have an answer. The pounding grew louder, more desperate. The windows rattled in their frames, and the fire flickered, casting wild shadows on the walls. Whatever was out there was angry, angrier than anything I had ever felt before. "We just wait," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the noise. We wait until daylight. The rest of the night was a blur of terror. Every minute felt like an hour. Every sound made my heart leap into my throat. We didn't sleep. We didn't dare move from the living room. We huddled together in front of the fire, clutching the shotgun like it was our last hope, and quietly crying over the loss of our father. The pounding on the door never stopped. The chains outside the house dragged back and forth, a constant reminder of the horror that waited just beyond the walls. And through it all, the candle in the Anderson cabin burned bright, flickering in the distance like a beacon of death. But somehow, we made it. By the time the first light of dawn broke over the mountains, the sound stopped. The pounding ceased. The chains fell silent. The candle in the cabin flickered out. We had survived another year, barely. But Dad never came back. Halloween in our holler had always been a test. But last year, it wasn't enough. Breaking the rules cost my dad his life. And everything is different. And I can't shake the feeling that this Halloween will be worse